Hey, can everyone hear me? Well enough? No, seriously, you can hear me though? Cool. Hi. So my name is Rob Bayless, and I'm here to talk today about how to build mobile apps using Cordova, the Apache Cordova project, and the Ionic Framework. The goal of this session is essentially to teach you all how to make mobile apps using nothing but CSS, JavaScript, and HTML, and to actually get those out onto devices. How many of us in this room are developers? Probably the vast majority. Okay, cool. So yeah, as web developers, we have a lot of skills, but generally those skills don't extend all the way to mobile app programming. So like, you know, Objective-C. How many people in this room know Objective-C? Got a few hands. And Java, I mean, same deal. So as web developers, we want to be able to publish mobile apps because that's what our clients sometimes want. And they're cool. They're hip. We are in San Francisco and sort of like the home of the app. So without any further ado, I'm going to get into exactly how we can do this using these tools. During this presentation, we're going to talk about what all these different pieces that I'm talking about are and where they fall in the chain of responsibility. We're going to talk about the basics of REST. So the app that we're going to be building here is based on a Drupal 8 backend, and we're going to be pulling content into an app using REST. And yeah, like I said, Drupal 8 is going to be the app backend for this, and I'm going to show you how to set up Drupal 8 out of the box with RESTful APIs. And we're also going to be diving right into the code and taking a look at what it takes to actually code the app. So the goal of this, we're going to be building a fictional app, and our goal is that we have a popular media site, and they cover content about all different kinds of pets. So they currently have a website, but they really want to deliver this content to users on their device. Their website is responsive, but they want users to have the full, you know, in-app experience with full screen and just whatever else people want out of apps. We're going to keep it pretty simple, though. It's just going to be a read-only app of the content that's on our site. This concept could be extended very easily, but for the purposes of this presentation, it's only going to read content. So the model that we're using here, we have our Drupal site, and our content creators want to be able to create content on the Drupal site. Drupal's really good at being an interface for content creators to drop content into. So the content creators will put the content into the site, and the site will serve as a repository serving two different audiences. You'll have your desktop browsers, or I guess when I say desktop browsers, what I really mean is the front end of the site, so the website itself. And you'll also have the mobile app, and those two different front ends for the site will be served from that same repository of content, which is our Drupal site. This is the app. It's called Tall Tales, and this nice logo was designed for it. I'm going to step you through what we want the app to actually look like. So we want the splash screen when it opens. Once you get past the splash screen, you want to be able to pick a type of pet that you're interested in, so cats or dogs. Once you select a pet that you're interested in, you can select a story. So this is an example of one story. And then when you actually do select a story, you want to see the content of the story, and we're going to have a nice big hero image up top with a picture of something related. To actually code this thing, what we're going to be using is several pieces. I guess I'll start from the bottom and work my way up. So the app needs to be ultimately compiled into native code for the device. Cordova is a project by the Apache Foundation that will let us take what is just a single page application, so a single page of HTML along with all the compiled assets for it, CSS, JavaScript, and put that into a native application where Cordova handles all the compiling, all of the device access, any of that stuff that we need. Alongside of that, we're going to have our front-end framework that we're going to be using to build the single-page app. In this case, we're using Angular. How many people have worked with Angular? Got a few. Okay, Angular, we're going to be diving into the actual code of it. So that's going to be managing the user interaction inside of our app. And then we're also going to have this thing called Ionic. And Ionic is a framework that integrates Angular and Cordova really neatly and provides some CSS wrappers for it as well. So you can think of it as essentially two components. You have the CSS component of it, and that's just a, what do you call it? CSS framework, thank you. So that's kind of like Bootstrap. It provides all your styling for how things look. And you're also going to have the framework component of it, which is going to hook into Apache Cordova and actually provides a command line tool for you to interact with your app. And we'll dive into exactly how that works. So like I said, Ionic is Apache Cordova plus AngularJS plus the CSS stuff. Cordova is the way that you actually package the stuff up and shoot it into the phone. And then Angular is the JavaScript front end, the framework that we're using to build the application. And then obviously we have Drupal. I think we all have some idea of what Drupal is. All right. So I mentioned REST earlier, and I think a lot of you probably have an idea about what REST is. For our purposes here, it's a set of architecture principles for managing access to a remote system. REST interactions happen through HTTP requests to an endpoint. And so when we kind of break that statement down, we have the action that's being performed on a REST resource. So in REST, we have a couple of different methods we can use that correspond directly to the HTTP request method. We have the GET method to retrieve a resource. We have POST, which is to create a new resource. We have PUT, which is to update a resource. And then we have DELETE, which obviously deletes a resource. When we talk about a resource in Drupal, we're basically talking about an entity. So a node is a resource. If you issue a GET request against a node URL, you're going to get a representation of that node back. Same with PUT and DELETE. So endpoints are structured URLs. In Drupal, we've historically had /node, which just lists a bunch of nodes that are on your Drupal site. And for any given endpoint, so since node is an endpoint in Drupal, you're going to be able to perform a couple of different operations. So you have the GET request to /node, which retrieves a list of nodes. You have a POST request to /node, which creates a new node. And then you've got a GET request to a single resource. So node/1 is an example of an individual resource. So if you issue a GET request to node/1, I think we all know what happens. You get back node/1. Same with PUT and DELETE. Pretty straightforward. The other thing about REST, endpoints can have different formats that they accept. So, you know, in Drupal 6, when you hit, or Drupal 6, Drupal 7, whatever, all the Drupals up until Drupal 8, when you hit node/1, you are always getting back HTML. So that is one representation of the node itself, is the HTML output. But in REST, we can also have different formats. So a couple others that we're going to be interacting with are application/JSON. So that's just a JSON representation of the node. XML is another way we can output it. And there's this one called HAL plus JSON, which is basically JSON with some additional metadata for discovery purposes on the node. Stuff like URLs for any relations that are contained within the node. And we'll take a look at that later on. All right, I'm going to dive into some code. Does anybody have questions before we get ahead of ourselves on the stuff I just talked about?
Are your slides posted anywhere so we can follow along?
They are not posted anywhere at the moment, but I can post them right after. Yep.
Just curious about authentication and session.
Sure. So that's something we're not dealing with within the scope of this presentation, but it's something that can be done pretty easily, and Drupal 8 comes with some different tools for using either basic auth or session authentication. Cool. So first things first, I'll walk you through the app as it's built. I'm running the iOS emulator here. You could also do this with Android. So one of the nice things, and I don't know if I fully explained this, but one of the nice things about Cordova and the Ionic Framework is that you can build these applications, and you build them once in HTML, and you ship them to either iOS or to Android, and it's basically the same compile process from your end anyway. So here we are on the splash screen. I'm going to hit the categories button. Oh, this is embarrassing. It's not actually working. Okay, so let's pretend we didn't see that, and I'm just going to show you the website. So this is the website that we have, and it's essentially the same process. You select a category. Here we have the URL category /1, which is just a view that serves up all the content in each category. So we have a story, and when we view the story, you can see the image and the content. So really, really simple. And if this app were working, let me just take a real quick stab at fixing it. Yeah, I don't know. So we'll do without the app for right now. But inside the Drupal site, this is a Drupal 8 installation, and as I mentioned, Drupal 8 comes with tools to create RESTful endpoints out of the box. This is an older installation. I think it's one of the betas, but the same thing is essentially true for RC2 or modern versions. So I'm going to look at the module page on my Drupal site, and what I'm looking for here is the REST module. And that's RESTful Web Services, so you can see that I've enabled that module. I've also enabled the HAL module along with it, and HAL is a format that I mentioned earlier for serialization. So when we ship out an entity, it can be in a given format, and JSON/HAL is one of the formats that we're going to be using. You can see we also have a way to enable basic authentication for these REST endpoints, but we're not concerned with that since this is a read-only app. And then I've also enabled the REST UI module. And the REST UI module is a contrib project that actually lets you see what you're doing. So Drupal, the RESTful Web Services module doesn't actually provide a user interface, and so the RESTful UI module does let you see it for the purposes of this presentation. So I'm going to take a look at that. And here we are at the REST resources page. Let me blow this up a little. And you can see that we've got a couple of different enabled endpoints. So we've got the node endpoint, so /node, and then you can enter a parameter of the node ID. We've enabled also the file endpoint, so this one is entity/file. And then we've also got the taxonomy term endpoint. So that would be taxonomy term ID. So these two especially, node/node ID and taxonomy/term ID, should look really familiar. This is nothing brand new. Even though we've enabled the RESTful web services module, if we actually go to node/5 in the browser, we're going to get the HTML representation of that. If I look at node/5 and request it in JSON format, you can see that I get a very different thing. But it's essentially the same content, just in a different format. So if we look at the endpoint properties, or the actions that are actually enabled on these endpoints, we only enabled the get method for these endpoints. So when I look at the content endpoint, which is our node endpoint, you can see that I've only enabled get requests there, and I've only enabled JSON and HAL-JSON as the formats. I could also allow post, delete, and patch, but I'm not going to do that because this is a read-only app. If you wanted to take this a step further and actually start creating content from your app, that's totally possible. You just need to enable these alternate endpoints and set the permissions accordingly. Yeah, let's see. So that's basically all there is to see on the Drupal 8 side. Yeah.
It said patch there, but early on it said it was put. Is put equal patch?
No, so those are actually two different actions.
Okay.
So there is, oh, that's actually astute observation. So Drupal, I believe, is treating, doesn't recognize the put method. I think what happens is you issue a post request. If you wanted to do, so put is the update action or method. So if you wanted to update a node in Drupal REST, what you would actually do is issue a post request to the node resource. So you would post to node/1 the JSON that you needed. Patch is HTTP method for updating individual properties of, or like small pieces of the node. So if you wanted to update one field, you could issue a patch request to node/1. So that's the difference there. Yep.
Permissions for being able to update the content using the standard permissions placed on Drupal side?
So yes, so it does go through the node access system. So if your user account has permission to update the node or delete the node, then you will be able to issue a post or a delete request against it. But there's an additional permission required, which is permission to use the endpoint and use the method, I think. So let me show you that. Yeah. So we actually have to additionally enable users to actually issue the delete request on content resources and stuff like that. So it's like an additional sanity check, and they need to have both permissions, permission to access the node and permission to issue the request. I will also show you one more thing in Drupal 8, which I really love. So Drupal 7, Drupal 6, you always needed some JSON at some point, and there was no real way to get that without a contrib module. Drupal 8 lets us do this nice REST export display for views. So when I look at this categories view, this is the same view that's serving up this page. But it also, so it's got the page display, which is what we're seeing in HTML, but it's also got the REST export display, and that uses the serializer to export stuff in the format that you're looking for. So if you wanted to get really performance picky about this app, you could skip using the actual endpoints altogether and just output everything you need with a single view. And I'll show you. So this is the categories listing for the system. So this is just listing both cats and dogs, these two terms, and it's just putting it out in JSON. So we've done that, and the reason that we've done that, at the time that I put this presentation together, I'm not actually sure if this is still true, there was no way to get a RESTful listing of content, so you would not be able to you wouldn't be able to issue a GET request to /node and actually get back JSON content. So I put together views to let that happen. I have the categories view that outputs the terms that I need. I have the content by category view that outputs, it accepts a term argument and outputs the content that's within that term. And those are the only two that I need. And I put them at API/categories and API/categories placeholder, where placeholder would be a term ID. All right, so let's hop over to the application itself. And first thing that we're going to see here, can everyone basically see this? Okay. First thing we're looking at is this front end directory, and this is the result of running the Cordova create command. Which I will show you how that works. So I'm actually running the Ionic create command. Nope, I'm not. There is a create command. Don't remember exactly what it is, but it sets up this directory structure for you, exactly like we were looking at in PHP Storm. You've got a couple of different directories here. The ones that actually matter are the www directory, which is your assets for the application. And then outside of it, you've got a few things that are actually useful to know about. You've got a Bower file. If you haven't used Bower before, it's kind of like Packagist. It's a package manager for JavaScript. And that's how we're going to do installation of different libraries that we need. So since we're using Ionic for this, Ionic does come bundled with AngularJS. And we've additionally pulled in the Angular resource library, which is going to handle our REST queries. Okay, jumping into this www directory, we do have one single page that this app is going to load, and that's our index.html. So when the app boots, it's going to go to the index.html, and it's going to read it, and it's going to execute the code that's there. So this is pretty standard HTML. We just have our CSS stuff included, and we've got the Ionic CSS framework included up top, and then our own custom CSS down below. I really don't need very much CSS for this app. I have a single line of CSS, and that's it. Down here, we've got the Ionic JavaScript library. So that includes both Ionic's customizations on top of Angular, as well as Angular itself. And then we include that Angular resource module that we downloaded a second ago using Bower. And then we also include the Cordova script. And Cordova is how we're going to access any of our device APIs. We don't actually need to do that for this application. But if you needed access to like the camera or the GPS, that's where you would need to include this Cordova script and call the Cordova APIs. Down below, we have a few of our own custom JavaScript files that have all of the application-specific logic in it to bootstrap Angular and set it up with all the different controllers we need. And we'll be going into those momentarily. Down here in our body, we've got the ng app tag on this, and this is an Angular directive that says, hey, Angular, when you get here, go ahead and bootstrap this application that we have called Tall Tales. And below that, we've got a couple of Angular directives for navigation. So I'm going to see if I can actually get this app going in the browser. So there are a couple of different Ionic commands that I can run. And Ionic is just some glue around Cordova. So for any of these commands I'm about to run, you can actually run the Cordova equivalents just as easily. So I can use Ionic emulate iOS, and that says package this application up and send it to the emulator. And that's what I've done here. Obviously that wasn't working past the splash screen, so we're going to pop this application open in our browser. One of the really sweet things about doing applications this way is that they're also totally valid HTML pages. So if I say Ionic serve, it's going to pop open a browser window with my application in it. And it looks obviously terrible because it's huge. Hey, it's working. Nice. So, yeah, this is the Tall Tales application, and since I didn't step through this earlier, the categories page, within this, you pick a category, pick a story, and it shows you the story content. So on the back end, this is all pulling from our Drupal site, so these are the same exact stories that we have there. So anyway, what you're looking at there is the same stuff that we were looking at in PHP Storm a moment ago. We have the ng app tag. This is our index.html. Okay, so down here we have the Ion nav view Angular element. So when the application gets bootstrapped, there's the navigation bar, and then there's what actually is in the content of the application at any given time. And that's placed right inside these tags, these Ion nav view tags. So that's it. That's really all the HTML that we have to write for the skeleton of our app. Beyond that, it's going to be controllers and templates. So just starting to dive into the Angular stuff, we have our application here, and we bootstrap a module called Tall Tales, which corresponds exactly to the tag, the ng app tag that we saw on the index.html. And it requires the Ionic module. So essentially make sure that we have the Ionic module before this module starts, and also make sure that we have our own controllers module and our own services. I'll go into those momentarily. For configuration, we're going to set up a few what are called states. This is kind of like a router for your application. So it says when we're at the URL /app, that corresponds to the state name app. And we're going to use a template that's specified here, and we're going to use the controller that's specified here. If you look at how these URLs are built, you see the hash sign, and then it's /whatever. So when I am just at the root here, you can see it's /app, and that corresponds to that app state. Looking at the template for this thing, it's pretty simple. You've got an Ion view, and so Ion view and Ion content, the next one down, are the two that kind of combine to replace themselves into the Ion nav view container in your index.html. All we're doing for the welcome screen, the splash screen, is printing out an image. And we've got a variable here. This looks a lot like Twig syntax, but this is actually an Angular template. We print out the logo variable in the source of the image tag. And we create a button, a link button, that actually just links to /categories, which is the next state we're going to look at. You may be wondering how this variable is populated, this logo variable. That's coming from our controller. So if we remember when we set this state up, we gave it the template URL, and we also gave it the controller, which is welcome control. So inside welcome control, this is our controller module, and we declared the controller welcome control. And then we have this magic scope variable that gets injected into the controller callback. When Angular runs, it creates the scope variable. You populate what you need into the scope, and then the scope gets injected into the template. So here we're setting the scope.logo to the path of the logo. And then inside the template, we're just referencing that logo. And we don't have to use $scope.logo. All right, so that is our first state. Next, moving on to that categories state, which is right after you leave the home page, you hit categories, and you're on this page. So for this one, it's a little bit trickier. We have a REST query that needs to be made in order for this page to be generated. So we need to know what the categories are that are in our Drupal site. So for this one, we have the categories controller, and we have a template for it, and we set the URL as well. I'm going to dive into the template first, just to show you how that looks. Inside here, we have, again, that view and Ion content element. And then we have a link that has an ng repeat element. So the ng repeat element is essentially a loop. So for what this says is for every category that is in the categories variable, print out one of these link tags. And we set the href attribute to categories / this is going to look really familiar and painful to anybody who's done Drupal before. Category.tid0value. Yeah. So when that's actually rendered, you can see that the href becomes categories /1 for cats, because categories.tid value is equal to 1 for the cats category. So that corresponds directly with what we have on our Drupal site. Categories /1 is the cat category. So that's the template. Then if we take a look at the controller, it's really simple. So we have categories control here, and that's the controller that we're using on this page. Again, we have that scope variable, which we know and understand. And then we also have this kind of magical category variable, which I'll show you in a minute. Inside the controller, we're just setting up the scope.categories by calling the query method on this category object. And so that says grab all the categories and set them into the scope for the template, and when we get into the template, we're going to loop through them. So category is something that we've defined in our services file, and it is what is known as an Angular resource. So here I am in the services file. I've got this $resource thing. When I create this category service, I get to inject a couple of things in it. The first thing I'm injecting here is that $resource variable, and that is an Angular resource. So that's what's actually going to make RESTful queries to our Drupal site. So what I do, I call that resource object with backend. Backend is the variable that I've set for my application backend. So that allows me to toggle it on a global level in the application back and forth between like a development server or something like that. And we can see here that I've set taxonomy/term TID as the resource URL, and I've forced it to use JSON format when it calls this URL. And then I've specified one method for this thing, which is the query method. And I get to say, okay, we're going to use the HTTP method get, and this is the URL that you need. Technically, with a lot of RESTful endpoints, you're not going to need to specify the individual actions that can be performed on the endpoint. But since I had to create that view to list out the categories rather than hitting taxonomy/term, that's why I had to do this. So that's our category service. It's as simple as that. We just told it some things about our endpoint, and Angular resource takes care of the rest. If I look at the network requests that are made when loading this page, we can see that it makes a call to categories on our Drupal site, and the Drupal site nicely returns these things that have that disgusting format that we all love, TID 0 value. So yeah, pretty simple. And then obviously once we have those categories, we build them into the page here in the template. Continuing on, we have a really similar situation for the individual for the stories list page. So we have a state called category articles. It's got a URL of category/TID, and then it's got the template and the controller. Stuff gets a little repetitive at some point, but so again, we have the link that's repeated here, and here we're linking to the article instead of the category. Inside the category controller, we're going out and we're querying for the individual category. So we need to know the name of the category in order to print it in the nav bar. And we call the get method on that category object, same one we used above, but instead of query, we're just using get, which means get an individual value. As far as the things that are injected here, we've got the scope, which we do know about. We've got state params, which is kind of like it's your route variables. So since we created the URL of, what was it, categories/TID, we can then grab that, we can grab that TID variable out of the state params object. And that's something that Angular provides. Category we know about, and then article is also an Angular resource which we created in that services file. And it's pretty similar to what we did with the category object. We give it a resource URL of node/node ID. We make sure that we're using the JSON format for it. and then we specify where the query method points to. One thing to note with these resource definitions, even though I'm specifying the query action here, there are several other actions that Angular resource includes out of the box. So those would be get, delete, update. Those sort of actions are implicit in this definition. So we have query and we also have get are the ones that are useful to us. And again, I had to specify this query method because I can't just, by default, Angular would post to node with the JSON format, and that wouldn't actually give us any output out of this Drupal site. So instead, we point it to the view and get the posts that are within a category directly.
Why not just put that in the line above?
Good question. So what we have here is we're specifying the query method. So this is when we say query is like list a bunch of these things. So we have two operations that we're using. We have the query operation where we list a bunch of categories, articles, whatever. And then we have the get operation where we get a single category, article, whatever. So when we act on a single category or article, we're going to hit the normal endpoint for it. So that would be node/1. So that's the actual endpoint for this thing. We're just using a weird URL for the query endpoint. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay, continuing on. The last state that we have here is the article state, and you can probably guess how that one's going to go. We print out the image, we print out the body inside this this template. And one thing to note here, we're actually using the ng-bind-html attribute, which inserts escaped URL, or I guess semi-escaped HTML into this element. So it allows some HTML to pass through. So if we had like a link in here, or actually we do have paragraph tags inside of the HTML that's coming from Drupal. So it allows it to pass through. If we look at the network tab on this individual article page, we can see that there are two calls being made. One is for the article itself, and this is the structure of the node. Looks really similar to what we saw with the terms. The second request we made is to a file endpoint. So we're requesting the image in order to get the URL, and I'll explain that in just a moment. Inside the controller, you can see that we're doing a query or a get method, a get call on the article itself using the NID param. And then once we have the article, we're actually going back and we're loading the file out and setting it to the image. The reason that we have to do that is that when we get the article back, what we get for field image doesn't include the URL. It actually just includes a target ID. So that requires us to go back to the server for another trip to get that image, and then we can grab the image URL out of there. And if we look at the service, it's pretty much just the same thing. One thing to note here, with the file endpoint, we didn't actually need a query method, so I just skipped it. And I am requesting HAL-JSON for the file. And just to show you the difference here, so we have the embedded and links property, which we do not have for the JSON format. And if we look at what's in these things, links include things like the URL to the image, information about the type of object that we're dealing with. I don't actually know if I can put this into the browser. No. So this is so that's HAL.json just includes a little bit of extra discovery data. From my experience, I don't actually use HAL.json very much, but I could see as things get more and more RESTful out there, it could be nice to have that additional data. All right. I believe that's about all I have. And I will put that GitHub URL of all this code up at the end. Does anyone have questions? Yep.
To take this a step further, so this would be with an active connection to the
Yep.
to Drupal. What's entailed to make it then a local cache version?
Sure. So I've used I think it's called Angular Cache Resource. Sorry?
Would you mind repeating the question?
Yeah. So his question was, so this is an example of how to do this using a live connection to a Drupal site. But how would we go ahead and do this for, if we needed to cache it or if we needed to view it offline? And so the answer to that, probably the easiest way is to use the Angular Cache Resource library, which just all we would do is when we set up those resources, we would specify that they were a cached resource. And what would happen is when you go to view the page for the first time, it would download it and put it into the local storage cache. And then the next time you go to view that page, it would grab it out of the cache. It would also try to go to the server if it could make a connection, but if it couldn't, it would still let you read those stories out of the cache. Yep.
Two questions. So, one, does the Cordova JS handle things like accessing all of the native features of the phone? Like I can get a picture on the phone and send it back, and it just does that?
Yep. So, I mean, it still has to go through your device's like access control methods and stuff like that. So what will happen is if you need to access the camera, you will be able to access the camera or you'll call the API and it'll pop up an alert to the user saying this app is trying to access the camera. Do you wish to allow? So assuming you hit allow, Cordova is then, using those APIs, you're allowed to grab a picture and ship it back to wherever you need it to be.
And it just uses Cordova?
Yeah, so you use JavaScript to interact with Cordova, but Cordova translates that into whatever native methods that it needs. And it does a great job of making sure that those APIs are consistent between both Android and iOS as well.
And then the other question was, so this was for D8, is the primary difference that D8 gives you the endpoint, but I could also do this in D7?
That's exactly right. Yep. Yeah, there's no reason this actually has to be D8. It's just really sweet that I could set up a demo site with the only contributed module I have on there is REST UI. Yep.
So you printed an image that is the absolute URL to the image that Drupal's pretty good about using styles.
Yep.
When you're using the REST module, are you able to process it or feed it in any way before sending it to the app?
That's interesting. I think that would actually be, if you wanted to do that, that would be a good case for using HAL.json. You could add a property under links here that is like thumbnail. So you would have like the URL of the image itself. You would have the thumbnail version of it. And you could do that using the serializer system. There's a lot of things you can do in terms of like how you hook into generation of the serialized form of different entities.
I guess my question was, this system sort of bypasses the display settings on the
Yes. Yep.
So that's independent. That's part of the Drupal's theming system.
Yeah.
as opposed to the-
That's exactly right. Yeah, it's totally separate from Drupal's theming system. You're interacting with the data, like the API data directly. Yep. Yep.
Sometimes you have, you have your website and your app, and you have functionality that you want to exist on both.
Yep.
That you might have done in, clients like Javascript, something like that, or just JavaScript. How have you found it to maintain that consistency? Like, say, for example, like a category page, you want to do a nice drop down with a little thing, and maybe some logic saying if they're in this region or that region, then show this, right?
Yep.
Have you been able to share libraries across and say, when you're on the website, use this JavaScript, so you're not rewriting that same functionality, same functionality on
Sure.
the website? Okay.
So I haven't actually done that, but that's a great idea. There's no reason that you couldn't share the Angular code that you used back with the website. The one caveat to that would be that Ionic is not something that works on. Well, you could use. I actually think you might be able to use parts of Ionic, but it's going to get a little messy. So I think you're going to end up needing like separate templates for the website and the mobile app, just because Ionic is a piece that won't flow totally smoothly back and forth. But to answer your question, there's no technical reason you couldn't use the same Angular modules for both sides.
Okay. Then I have another question about somebody else's questions.
Okay. Yeah. Did you have a question? How would you compile it for either iOS or Android? Yeah, so this is where it gets a little tricky. It's really easy to compile. Cordova compile iOS. Great. So I just compiled it for iOS. If I had set up Android, I could do the same thing. So that gets you to the step where the app is compiled. The next step is going to be submitting that to an app store and actually getting it out there into the world. And that step is way beyond the scope of this presentation, unfortunately. It's very complicated, but getting to the compiled step is really easy. One thing I would also say, this Ionic project does have paid or a company component to it, and they do a lot of cool stuff. So the Ionic company has an application called Ionic View, where you can get your app out there and have it be beta tested or whatever. You can, using the Ionic CLI, upload it to their servers once it's compiled, and then you can access it inside the Ionic View app. So that's a good way to kind of get this thing out there and try it out on different devices without needing to go through the full App Store approval. Did you want to ask your second question?
What do you think of this compared to React Native?
I haven't used React, so I can't tell you. It's a cool idea, though.
Can you put that other screen back up with the URL?
Yep. Great. Well, if there are no more questions, I think I'm about out of time. And thank you all for coming.